Hello and welcome to Movies and Tea, and more importantly, welcome to our After Hours block. I'm your host, Elwood Jones, and joining me, of course, is our very own final girl, Miss Kim Lowe.
Hello.
Tonight we are going to be looking at Cabin in the Woods from 2012, directed by Drew Goddard and co-written with Joss Whedon. A film which gives a unique spin on the traditional horror tropes as a group of 5 friends spend a weekend at a secluded cabin in the woods, only to soon find that everything is not as it seems, as unaware that their every move is being watched by a vast network of puppeteers. So, Kim, I mean, this was a film we obviously talked about when we were doing the production for our Fincher season. And it was a film that I was really into, and I think you were kind of like mixed on it, I believe.
I don't know. I feel like every time I watch Cabin in the Woods, this is like the third watch I had to prep for this one, I kind of like it a little bit more. We're heading towards a much more positive. I feel like the first time I watched it, maybe I missed a lot of the detail, and then I feel like I forgot a lot of the detail. And then I'm starting to see a lot more of it now.
Okay. That's interesting. So, well, the film itself, I mean, it was written, as we mentioned already, by Drew Goddard and Joss Whedon, who previously worked together on the likes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, 2 series which, in turn, had reworked many aspects of horror cinema. And they wrote the screenplay in 3 days, describing it as an attempt to revitalize the slasher film genre and as a critical satire on torture porn. So this is a film, as we said already, much like Scream, it sort of looks at the many sort of familiar tropes of the genre and gives it all a very unique spin, and in many ways a very Whedon-esque spin, as here horror meets with real-world banality. As we're not just focusing on this group of teens who are going off to the woods and falling foul to whatever's lurking in the woods, but we're also looking at the puppeteers who are the ones pulling the strings and making all the things which happen in the cabin happen. In particular, we're following 2 engineers, Stetson and Hadley, who are basically the ones who control a lot of what's happening in the cabin. And we open with just them having a very banal sort of conversation, in particular a conversation about how Hadley's wife has baby-proofed their house and the fact he can no longer get into his fridge anymore, while at the same time we've got this background chatter of what's happening with different centres around the world as they gear up to complete this year's ritual, which will in turn help save the world, but in what cost? So the actual sort of setup for this one, Kim, I mean, how do you find this sort of setup? I mean, obviously it's a twofold story. I mean, obviously we've got the teens in the woods, which is our sort of traditional horror story, and then we've got the behind the scenes story, which for myself is kind of the more interesting story at play here. I always find that the stuff happening with the laboratory and these engineers to be a lot more interesting than what's actually happening in the woods.
Well, I wouldn't say that. Like, I would say that definitely that's the twist that makes Cabin in the Woods stand out from your traditional horror movie. But at the same time, they both go hand in hand. Everything that goes on in the HQ, I guess, kind of affects what goes on in the cabin, and there's this level of also that they actually the teens in the cabin has a say in pretty much their choices will decide how eventually they'll meet their death, right? And that's the kind of more fun part of it, because in the end, you watch them as they're I mean, in this whole cellar scene that I'm guessing we'll talk about later, it really gives that different feeling that, you know, it's kind of a bit, I don't know. It gives a bit of mystery, because in the whole time, you know, they talk about rituals, and then they talk about the different headquarters and the updates on the different scenarios and how they're all having issues. And then but you never really know what this is all about. You hint things here and there throughout, and I think this is really what really stands out in Cabin in the Woods. It's not really maybe the acting or the pieces, but it's more how the whole story is written and just the creativity behind the story that they're using. And with that, folding in all of these, I guess, more familiar scenes. I think one of the most familiar scene would probably be when the teens get to the cabin and you see that the camera it feels a lot like you're watching Evil Dead.
Yeah.
The whole cabin in the woods, and then the camera goes down onto the ground, taking like that ground angle, just like in Evil Dead. And I really like that. It kind of folds in that, it brings in, like you said, the usual tropes of, or something like that, of horror movies that we're used to, but then it gives them their own twist in this event where, I don't know, I guess in some ways you start wondering whether a lot of behind every horror movie and every creature is it really like someone could be just in their headquarters maneuvering some kind of crazy crap, right?
Exactly. I mean, this is the great thing about the film. I mean, we've seen numerous times, teens going into the woods and bad things happening. I mean, you mentioned already, I mean, it uses that same sort of, there's the familiarity of the cabin when we see it, that as you mentioned already, I mean, we instantly think of like Evil Dead, and we start thinking of like Friday the 13th, like just these surroundings are so familiar to us. Teens taken away from society, they're free of the strains of everyday life, so they go all crazy and can drink beer and engage in premarital couplings and whatnot. And what we see here is that the fact that when we're like watching these films and we question like, why are you making these stupid decisions? And with Cabin in the Woods, it's essentially like you make stupid decisions because the puppeteers want you to make stupid decisions. And it's these sort of little tricks that they put in. It's sort of like, oh, we're going to pump pheromones in to the cabin so that they become really horny, or we're going to pump this gas in so they just make really stupid decisions. And then you mentioned already that whole basement sequence where they essentially choose their own fate. And that seems just so peppered with so many great little layers. The fact that you look at all the different trinkets that are in the basement and how each of them are all linked to the potential monsters that can be unleashed on the cabin.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because when you go to the cellar, you look at all these trinkets and you might not think about it. Say in your first watch, you might not think about it right away, and you'll brush a lot of it away as you're looking at it. But when you go back to, obviously, in a much later scene near kind of like the big finale, when the teens meet this headquarter area, and then they end up just realizing what they're a part of, you start seeing these different monsters show up, and these different creatures that are in their own, I guess, glass cases or something.
Yeah.
And it's this incredible moment where you kind of think back to the different objects that each of them picked up, and if they were one step faster than what they eventually ended up choosing to do, what other way would they have met their death, right?
It certainly just opens up like this whole like smorgasbord of gruesomeness that could have potentially before these characters. And it's kind of funny when you're watching the sequence, you kind of like willing them to go towards different options. That, it's sort of like, you're like, oh, don't pick up the book, play with the puzzle orb, or blow in the conch shell because I want to see that monster. Rather than the ones, the redneck torture zombie family that we do get, which are really just sort of like a sampler of what's to come. And I kind of like appreciate the fact that while the film could have just like teased out and just shown us the glass case sequence when we get into the underground of the organization, and just sort of like left it at that we don't just get that, we get a full payoff, and we essentially get everything. We get to see all the toys that are in the toy box, at least in this wonderfully bloody finale. But I mean, just to go back to like Hadley and Stinson, I mean, the inspiration for these characters really came from Goddard, who grew up in Los Alamos in New Mexico, and he would see people like, you know, Hadley and Stinson. They're going around their usual everyday mundane lives, doing water cooler talk, and at the same time they're working on these weapons of mass destruction. And he thought, well, you know, it would be the same for these people. You know, we're essentially holding the fate of the world in our hands. We're having to carry out this ritual, but at the same time, you know, they're everyday people. They've become so used to the routine that it's all very sort of passé to them now. The fact that they have now instilled all these sort of distractions for themselves, such as the fact that the staff now bet on which monster is going to be unleashed in that wonderful sequence where we got the board which has got all the monsters on it, and it's like, oh, which one's going to appear and who's going to win the sort of sweepstake here. But even when we're not looking at what strings are being pulled here, there's lots of really fun fake scares, such as when we look at the scene where Jules is being dared to make out with the mounted wolf head, and we're so sure in our heads that something bad's going to happen. So it's not just...
That's the thing is, there's so many objects in here, and you don't know... Right from the start, there's a lot of... You're not really certain what the end goal is. The whole time, they're kind of, you know, you're hinting towards a lot of the purpose of this ritual and what's going on, and all that stuff, and it all unfolds in the final scene when we meet the president, which is played by a cameo role by Sigourney Weaver.
Because of course, why not?
Yeah, and it is, you know, like when Jules approaches that whole wolf thing, and then she brings in that big bad wolf. It's just so great because I would assume that at one point the wolf would have come into play if they were finding that object in that room, and it would have triggered the big bad wolf, obviously, that we got to see. So it's interesting because there's so much, you know, you don't know. There's so many different things that are going on, and a lot of things are in play, and we get a hint of what they're going into, like right from the beginning as they're entering through that tunnel. We have that, you know, they zoom into the eagle that hits a force field type of thing. Yeah. And right then, you already know that they're heading straight into a trap. And everything is set up. Every single trope that we know is a setup that's carefully planned, even from the moment that they left their house to decide to go to the cabin. It was every single little detail was planned by these engineers.
I think this is something I really love about the film, is the fact that right from the start we know what's going on. It's not like it's this big secret. We know that these guys are controlling what's happening in the cabin, and we're constantly flashing back and forth between the two, so we see what's happening in the cabin and we see how they're controlling it.
And it's really nice because, yeah, and it's really nice because they have this really nice cutting point, especially when they're using the dialogue and their scenario to cut between the two and have this really nice crossover between what's going on in pretty much, I don't know, what do you call it, the office, the headquarters, the lab, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then the facility and what's going on in the cabin. And I think that that's so smart because obviously the most obvious one is when they're like, let's get the party, whatever, going or something like that. I forgot. I'm not cool. I don't remember what the line was. So, and then they were saying the same thing in both scenarios, which was pretty nice. And then at the same time, they have a few of those moments that really cut really well into each other.
Yeah, definitely so. I mean, I love the Harbinger, who is basically just the creepy guy who has to provide the warning at the gas station. And we got the scene where Hadley just leaves him on hold. So the guy's there giving his little rant, and he's just on hold, and he gets really pissed at him. I thought that just gets me every time. But yeah, these little steps that they take, and you think, oh well, we know what's going on, and it's only when we get to the end that they still manage to pull out this amazing twist. it's sort of like, well, what we assume that they're just like the whole thing is just that they're the ones who control everything, but it's the reason why they're controlling everything, what the greater purpose is that they managed to hide right into the end. And I still think it gives us this ending where you sort of like the journey has been so enjoyable and the world building is so great in this film that you kind of want there to be a sequel, yet at the same time they break the film in a way that it can't be a sequel, even though people were still asking when the film was shown. Initially, they asked Joss Whedon, it's so like, oh, would you do a sequel? And he's like, did you not see how the film ended?
But yeah, I mean, I think it's really nice. I think one of the best parts, I think, is where in the end we have this whole description. I think the big twist is the whole description of why everything goes down the way it is. Everything is played that way to appease to what they call the Ancient Ones. And it plays a lot on, say, even the group that they've chosen, to the characteristics of each of the roles that the teens have, which is obviously your typical 5 people that we usually see as a group in teen movies and teen slashers.
Yes, I mean they obviously play into the usual sort of tropes that we see in this film. So you got the jock, the slut, the brainy one, the fool, as they put it, and obviously the virginal final girl. So
right. And it goes all the way right down to like the sequence that they die, which is very similar in most slasher films, and it all goes down to the purpose of why the sequence is chosen that way.
It's a great way to sort of tie the two. I mean, obviously throughout history, obviously there's numerous documentation of sacrifices and people being made. So of course this idea that these sacrifices have always continued, and the fact that the process has just become more streamlined, more modernized as it's gone on. The fact that we still have these sort of ancient rites, but they just obviously adapted to the times, and this idea that we've always been familiar with them, but we've never known their true sort of purpose, and this is what the organization controls. I also love the fact that we obviously follow the American wing of the organization, but we see through the monitors there's 4 other organizations around the world, including Japan, whose sort of tropes fall into more traditional sort of Asian horror sort of tropes. So we have like the scary long-haired ghost girl and weird rituals that end up turning their ghost into a frog, which just made me laugh as well. But the whole idea of the organization, it really feels like an expansion of the Initiative, which we saw in Buffy season 4, who were like a government group who were like tackling the threat of monsters and vampires and things within the real world. And when we look at the organization in this film, it feels very much like an expansion of that, but here they're all about doing controlled releases of the monsters rather than just capturing monsters, even though we do obviously see, like, on the board there's like groups for wranglers and security and zoologists, so it goes a lot deeper than just people pulling levers and unleashing things on the world. There's like whole departments dedicated to control and capture and maintaining the infrastructure of this group, which it's these smaller details that I think other directors may not have bothered to include, and I think this is just very Whedon-esque when we look at the worlds he's created, things like Dollhouse and Angel and Buffy, that they have these sort of small details. These are all very sort of elements we've come to expect from the worlds that Whedon creates. The fact they're so sort of grounded in the everyday, yet at the same time have this fantastical edge to them.
I was just thinking how different of a movie this is that we did in our season 1 after hours of a Joss Whedon written film in your eyes compared to this one.
Well, again, in your eyes, I mean that was like, oh, how do we do a romance where they don't see each other, they just see what the other person sees?
Yeah, so I mean, like, Whedon is really really talented. I mean, he definitely has an eye for creating these really great stories, and I really love the fact. I mean, obviously with In Your Eyes is the exception, but a lot of the movies that are similar to his, he brings in a very similar cast. And I mean, in this one, obviously we have familiar faces like Franz Kranz as Marty, and then who plays pretty much the fool, I guess. And then you have the scientist kind of role, or I think she's the chem lab or something. I don't know. And Amy Acker is in this, and I really love Amy Acker, especially when she was in Dollhouse, and both of them were in Dollhouse, I believe. So it was and I mean, I really love those roles a lot, and seeing them here is, I think when I first watched this movie, it was really the cast that kind of had a nice. I guess I kind of like the cast. I mean, I remembered a few of the characters. I mean, the guy who plays Holden was in Grey's Anatomy. I think he was starting out in Grey's Anatomy or something, and that was pretty good. And then obviously you have Chris Helmsworth before his. I think it's right before his Avengers fame.
Yeah, basically, I mean, this film, it was they made it and they basically shelved it. And it was only when, obviously, Thor came out and was making megabucks, it was all like, oh, what other Helmsworth movies we got lying around? So they sort of dusted it off and wheeled it out. So
yeah,
which I think was a smart move. And it's hard to think the fact that they just, they had this film just sitting around. They thought that it would not have a market because it's such a fiercely original take on the horror film, and it's like when you saw Scream for the first time, and it sort of like felt like this breath of fresh air. Because the problem with horror is it often gets caught up in whatever's popular, and it just runs it into the ground. So when you have someone give like a fresh take on the horror genre, it's always kind of exciting. And I think not since Scream and I've been so excited like watching a horror movie and just like seeing familiar tropes just like being reworked in such a clever way.
I think that's the thing. Like to bring in these to replay these things and make it feel like everything happens for a reason. It's not because these are tropes to us because we're so desensitized by horror, or if you watched all these Hollywood movies, they really play on these things all the time. But this takes a different angle into it. Every little detail that you see is set up on purpose. And it makes you rethink that the horror genre and the horror world and just the genre of slashers. And I think that's really, I think that a lot of it goes down to obviously the director has a good eye, but at the same time he also, Whedon, I think, brings a lot into this picture.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think you can obviously tell that obviously with Goddard and Whedon, they'd obviously worked together numerous times before, and so they obviously have that working relationship. And it's hard not to see this as a Whedon picture because there's so much of his like his DNA all over this thing. Yeah, because it feels so familiar. It feels like you're looking at something within like the Buffy or the Angel verse. And again, it's the fact that both of them worked on both Buffy and Angel. It only sort of keeps it further ingrained within that universe. And it's when you look at as well as the cast that we brought in. I mean, you obviously mentioned already Bradley Whitford and Chris Helmsworth. You also got Richard Jenkins, who's like same as he's like J.J. Simmons. Whenever I see him on screen, I just know it's always going to be good.
Yeah, I mean, Richard Jenkins is really, really great. And, I mean, he's also one of those actors where he's in so many things in these, like, supporting roles that really adds a lot to the movie because he's such a great character. Like, he really knows he really can handle all kinds of roles.
Oh, yeah, I think with when it comes to Richard Jenkins, I think the more laid back you can have him be, the better he is. Because he just, as I said, just just how he handles dialogue is just so good. Like when you look at this dialogue, it's all pretty basic stuff, but the way that he handles it and that sort of like laid back sort of drawl, it just really sort of adds so much. And he has these two puppeteers just really have so much great working chemistry together. The fact that they've obviously done this so many times, to this working repertoire, and you see the outsiders of the group, like their security guy, that the I'm trying to remember his name
Truman?
now.
Brian White.
Yeah, who's basically, he's so by the book, and he just like completely, it's like he's almost like appalled at just how laid back that they are, even though he knows that that they're perfectly capable of getting this job done, but they're just like too laid back for him. He's too like wound tight. He's like, oh, we're gonna do everything by the book and everything. So, but with these two, they're just all like, they're joking and aggravating other staff members, and even, as I said, they even hold the monster pole, which is great when you look at that board and you compare it to the final scenes of the film, and you're sort of like crossing off. It's sort of like, oh, there's the giant snake. It's like, there's Faunus, the Lord of Pain, the doll people. The only person you don't actually see in the meltdown is Kevin, who's on the board, and apparently he's a normal looking guy who does very, very bad things, according to Goddard. So it's apparently they had it all set to shoot his bits, but it just never happened. So, but yeah, apparently there's around 137 monsters in the film. Not that I've like sat there and counted them or anything.
I'm sure someone would. I'm sure someone, if they haven't yet, someone will.
Yeah. And yeah, obviously, just to bring back, obviously, the Evil Dead there, you've obviously got the Deadites in there. You've also got the Angry Molesting Tree. Makes an appearance. Left 4 Dead 2 was actually going to do a tie-in with the film and do like levels in the game, which would mirror the end sequence we see here. But due to MGM going bankrupt, it never happened. But Valve, who made the game, still let them use characters from the game in the final sequence. So that was really nice of them. When it comes to obviously just the kids themselves, I mean, we obviously talked a lot about the organization, but the kids themselves as a group, do you find them a little disposable, or did you actually like them? Because I mean, they do initially make an effort to try and make them likable to be around, even though I don't understand why Kristen Connolly is hanging around in her underwear.
Well, she's at home, so
I know she's hanging around at home, but she's got people coming around, and she's still like just hanging around in like a vest top and her underwear. And I know there's people listening to this going, "Shut up, Elwood." There's nothing wrong with that scene. It's just, I'm sitting there watching it like this scene and going, why is she hanging around with like in front of her window as well? So she's in just her underwear, and it's all like, I was like, that made no sense, and it's all like.
No, it's like she was getting changed and then she got sidetracked.
But she has like her friends come in and it's sort of like, oh yeah, don't worry, it's just Dana in her underwear. So, and everyone's really blasé about this, which just made no sense. It's sort of like when Marty turns up with his epically huge bong. It's like, oh yeah, that's fun.
Which comes into play later on in the best way, I think.
But yeah, I think outside of Dana and Marty, the others are just so disposable. Like, I didn't care about Holden. I think Chris Helmsworth's care I kind of bought more into, just because him and Anna Hutchinson's Jules have got more of a sort of presence there. But Holden, I mean, I don't think
he's not meant in any horror movie, the scholar role isn't supposed to be meant to be, like very. It's not meant to be a standout role, I don't think.
I love as well the fact that when they start falling into their roles, because the drug's been put in there. So, with Jules, she's supposed to be the bimbo or the slut and that. So the fact that they've been putting chemicals into her hair dye to make her dumber, which I think was just really funny. But when you look at Holden and he's being turned into the scholar, he actually dons glasses.
Yeah.
Where Kurt just becomes like more of a jock and just more of a aggro personality, which is a fun contrast. At least they bother to show him as having like intelligence at the start when he's like recommending books to Dana about Soviet economics, so which I'm sure is going to be a real riveting read.
It's really nice because we watch the development of these 5 teens, and as the movie goes along, from their starting point where they're still themselves pretty much, you eventually go into where, like you said, Holden ends up wearing glasses, which I was a bit surprised because I was like, what? He wasn't wearing glasses before. Why? type of thing. And then you start having this conversation I think it was Marty who brings it up, of how they've changed, how Kurt and Jules' character has really changed from who they normally are. And we haven't known, we at this point, we haven't seen them enough in their own territory to really be able to see whether they've changed exactly that much. But if you really look at the details from the beginning till, where they get to have that comment, you really start seeing the differences of, right when they're having that road trip coming in, and then when you're in that scene where Kurt turns into this more, as he calls it, more of an alpha male role, which he usually isn't, and Jules is acting a lot more, it's just not herself, I guess.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you start thinking is that I guess one of the best parts is when you see Marty, who's doubting this entire time, and then all of a sudden there's that whispering voice in the background that comes out, and then he doesn't really hear what they're saying, but somehow it's kind of hypnotized him to just like do whatever they say.
Yeah, I still have no idea what the deal with the two-way mirror is supposed to be.
I think the purpose of the mirror was really to, I don't know if it was eventually come into play. If say they had chosen differently, maybe it would have come into play. But I think in this purpose, at least, it plays as the escape route for them to to be able to move between the rooms. I don't know if it's meant to have a deeper role than that, but I feel like it would have. But I'm just not sure what it would be.
Yeah, it's just like, why are we're in this cabin and we've got this two-way mirror, but it just really made no sense as to why it was there. So I just wonder if it was meant for them to discover that.
Okay. Because it feels like if they didn't discover it, and would it have changed the ending? But then in the end, who comes out of this is the changing factor that we thought Marty had died, right? And then he doesn't.
As I said, it's just the one thing. Everything else kind of makes sense in it, and I kind of think it's explained and whatnot. But just that random ass mirror, the only thing I can see is just so that they could put some mutual pairing in between Dana and Holden.
But it isn't, right? Because I guess so, but then because in the end it was like they had to change the scenario because they changed rooms, which is a little bit like they didn't expect the characters to do that.
Well, yeah, I know that when you put that creepy ass tapestry up of lambs to the slaughter, it's sort of like, when you think nobody's going to take that down. So, but I think this is something that we obviously don't have cabins in woods over here in the UK. I'm guessing you guys in Canada probably do, because got you more of a rural.
Yeah, we got a wilderness mentality, a lot of empty space.
So I don't know. It's something I always thought would be kind of cool to do. Go to a lake house or something, but we don't really have that over here. So at the same time, you watch these movies and you think, oh, that'd be kind of creepy as well. So
I think it's really the horror movie thing, right? Like sometimes you think about it and it's like we always, like, me and my husband, we always talk about if we were to retire at one point when we have enough money, we'd move to, like, away from, like, the big city civilization. Like, not even, like, suburban. You go into, like, rural area to live.
yeah.
But then you think about all the horror movies you watch about houses in the middle of nowhere, and you're like, even if something happens, there's no help, there's nothing. And then you just kind of feel like, I don't know, maybe I've watched too many horror movies. It's not a good thing. It's affecting my life choices.
When you see obviously the end of this film, it's a very sort of final note that it ends on. I don't know about yourself, but part of me kind of really still wants to see more. Whether we're looking like a different group or we're doing like a different sort of, because it'd be hard to use the same team that we see in this film. But I kind of want to see what was happen how things are run like in a different. One of the other branches of the organization. Like, I want to see how the Japan branch or the German branch run, and I still sort of hold out on the hope that one day we may see that. But at the same time, it's sort of like hard when you look at the foreign branches because it means it's got to be shot in a non-English language, which obviously provides its own sort of issues, not only in terms of distribution but also in terms of production. So it. Is there a particular country you would like to see the organisation for? Because obviously we see like Madrid and we see Germany and we obviously see Japan featured quite heavily here. Was there anyone in particular you thought sort of, well, I would love to have seen more of that?
I think it'd definitely be Japan. I mean, Japan has all these horror icons. It's one of those type of horror movies that I usually really does get me.
Yeah.
I mean, in reality, if you compare a lot of, say, horror of Japan to whatever, to even the States, you have a lot of, I feel like there are certain tropes, but Asia is more based on elements of belief, and that's why it would have been even nice to see the same scenario, how it failed, happen, like, on an alternate timeline, because if you were to use this current one, there's nothing that you can talk further about unless you go back to the origins of how this started, how ancient ones became the thing, or something like that, right? Because right now, it's pretty final where we're at. The only thing that would have been nice to see a sequel of it is, what is the end game? Like, if the ancient ones destroyed the world, you know, as what they predicted, if you don't live through with the ritual, what else happens? Like, what are these ancient ones? What do they do? Like, how are they destroying the world? Like, a bunch of, maybe it'll be like a survival horror sort of deal, right? I don't know. There's a lot of room to, it's not really, I feel like if you ever want to play on horror movies, it's really that how far of an angle you want to take it. It's never an end-all sort of deal. There's still a lot of room for this to go, but you wouldn't use back the same characters because obviously there's nothing to talk about unless you stretch it and you're like, oh, well, you know, Dana and Marty somehow make it out of there alive, you know?
And even if they do, it's sort of like, well, what do we do with them? I mean, they're not god killers. And it is a weird sort of end game to have. It kind of reminds me of the end game of the Resident Evil movies, where it's sort of like, oh, the whole plan was to eliminate all life on Earth so we can remold it in our own image, and it's sort of like what you've been left with is a pretty cruddy world. By the time it's been like nuked and it's infested with zombies and God knows what else, it's not a particularly great end game that you're running with here, guys.
Yeah, because that's the thing is, if you look at the ancient ones, right? The what they're saying is, if you don't give them the ritual, they'll pretty much pulverize the world. But what does pulverizing the world do for them? Like, I mean, in that sense, would you not think about the fact that maybe it's just really a threat? So it gets these people to keep creating these scenarios that that sacrifice and offer a blood offerings to them to keep them quiet. But I mean, in the end, would there be some other way? In any sort of apocalypse, you look at like what we always talk about, these apocalypse movies. Like, I mean, you can look at even like something like The 100 or something like that, TV series, The 100. It's like the end of the world. There's a nuclear thing. Everyone goes into space to live or something, and then when they come back, they realize that the land is still occupied by people. There's still people who has lived through this.
Yeah.
So, even when someone destroys the world, there's always some survivors, and that's another angle that you could have taken the story. It would have been a different way. It would be something like how Cloverfield went, right? Cloverfield had its found footage segment where they were running away from these things that are attacking the world. But then when you go to 10 Cloverfield Lane, it's something different. And that's definitely something that, Cabin in the Woods, if we were to see a sequel, it would have been interesting to see the different angles of the story.
You see, that's the thing, because I think if we try to continue with it, we're just going to sort of drift away in and start focusing on things that I don't particularly want to. And my only focus here is that I just want to see more of the organisation. That's the sole draw for myself here. They're the most enjoyable parts of the film, not what's happening with the teens. And I think by the time we remove all the dead wood from the teen group, we narrow it down to our key two. That as I said, that's all I want from that group. I just need someone to balance out everything else that's happening here, because at this point, when they go down into like the depths of the organization facility, and we have that whole sort of like meltdown sequence where all the monsters are unleashed, it's sort of like we need them there because we need someone to follow, because everyone else is just basically monster fodder at that point. So but yeah, it's sort of like how do we get more of the organization, but at the same time we can't. So it's I think it's one of those things that's just going to be just forevermore. It's going to be like, well, it's sort of like if only you'd gone a different way.
But I think that there's a lot of respect here in terms of how this movie chooses to end, because a lot of horror movies always give you that maybe continuation, this cliffhanger, this sort of thing, and I hate that. I hate that so much in horror movies, that it always needs to keep this open-ended ending type of thing, where keep it open-ended pretty much, where you have to, where it gives that possibility of something that's going to happen next, a possibility of a sequel. But with Cabin in the Woods, they just shut it down. They're like, okay, this is one movie. How this ends is how it ends. I'm not giving any other, opening to continue going. And that's a really brave move, because you're taking this movie, and maybe they didn't think it was going to be great or whatever, but it became a hit. And then now you have this, I don't know, but then, I mean, you don't know, maybe 10 years down the road, someone's going to want to do a sequel to it, because that's what happens in our world right now.
I know what you mean. There's a couple of films where they've ended on that sort of cliffhanger. I mean, Deep Rising ends on that cliffhanger, and the remake of The Blob ends on that sort of, it's not so much a cliffhanger, is it? It's more just the, where we could go from here, and they never obviously got sequels, and it just always frustrated the hell out of me. So
yeah,
maybe as I say, maybe it is for the best that we just end it on such a final note. So, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is a film where the good doesn't win. But this is the thing, good essentially wins, but we're punished for them winning. This is the one time we needed the bad guys to win. Well,
I think the deal is that they wanted to fight against the organization, because they didn't feel like what they were doing was right. When you're sacrificing everybody to meet an ends of the world ending. And then you see Dana in that moment but it's the world, it's the end of the world sort of deal. What choice do I have, right?
Yes, exactly. So, yeah. But no, as I said, I still really enjoy this film. It's still fascinating to me, the way it's sort of set up, the way it plays out, and all the sort of moves it makes. I think it's just such a wonderfully creative piece of horror cinema, and one that it plays such loving homage to the genre, while at the same time just feeling so unquestionably fresh. So it's definitely a unique one, and one I think that we just sort of one that is still just fun just to puzzle over. Even now, just to look at all the inner workings of it and try and figure out how it all comes together is still a lot of fun. So
yeah, I agree.
Should we get into further watching?
Yes.
Okay, so
how about you kick it off for us this time?
Okay. So for myself, if you obviously like Cabin in the Woods, I've got a couple of ones that I'm going to go with. And I was really sort of looking at the films which revived that sort of interest in horror. So obviously the first one straight off the bat would be Scream. I think Scream and Cabin in the Woods both operate on a similar plane of what they brought to horror cinema, and certainly giving things that sort of fresh feel again, which is certainly most needed. The other one I would want to go with is Cabin Fever, the Eli Roth original version, not the remake. As much as Eli Roth has done his best to annoy the hell out of all horror fans and just basically throw his career down the pan by playing the celebrity game rather than focusing on being this amazing horror director he apparently was originally setting out to be. And certainly when we look at Cabin Fever, it's got all this sort of freshness as a horror film that was certainly missing from the genre at the time, and it's just a shame that it sort of went rapidly downhill from there between his sort of personality and then his questionable filmmaking talents. So, but I think Cabin Fever, it pairs very nicely with this film and certainly brings a fun spin on sort of the viral sort of thriller. And the only other one I can think of, and this is sort of more of a stretch, and that would be to check out Wes Anderson's New Nightmare, which basically is a meta take on the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, as the lines between reality and the film world are blended, as it becomes apparent that Freddy Krueger may be getting out of the films and into the real world. This is a really sort of brave take on the mythology by Wes Craven. I thought that it really tried to do something new with a very sort of well-worn format rather than just trying to do more of the same. And while it's probably not the most perfect film in the series, it's sort of interesting the take it takes. And I think since its release, it's much like, you know, Halloween 3, it's been re-critiqued again, and I think people have a higher opinion now of it than they had when it was originally released. So those would be my 3 for you. But what about yourself, Kim?
Well, obviously, kicking off, I would go right away. I mean, I mentioned it, and that would be Evil Dead, which plays on the Cabin in the Woods genre, whether you watch the 1981 or you watch the remake of 2013.
Which is surprisingly good.
Yeah, both of them are really good choices. I mean, I actually like the 2013 one a little bit more than 1981.
Okay.
The original was a bit slow. But I mean, Evil Dead is right on with this. There's a lot of cues that pair up really well, and you can see where the original source of the Cabin in the Woods really started, and then you can go into something like, you can really see, I guess, the inspiration and a lot of the comparisons and a lot of parallels between the two movies. I mean, the next one I went with was Ready or Not, which is something of a similar thing, where the story is really similar in the sense that it's a group of people that need to act on a ritual to prevent eventually pretty much imminent death. So it's pretty much, you either do this, you have no choice, you have to do it, unless it's or else death will happen. Death will happen either way. It just depends how it'll happen to who. And I mean, Ready or Not is a fantastic movie. I mean, right now Samara Weaving is really great in these sort of roles. She's really gets into her character as the girl on the run, and this tough girl who gets caught in on her wedding night in this game that she ends up picking a really bad choice, the worst card in the deck, which means it's a life and death. It's a battle for life and death for her. And things get really out of hand, and there's a really good parallel in that sense of kind of being played by the people around you kind of deal, and kind of fighting back to it. So, I mean, Ready or Not is a really great choice in that sense. I don't really have another one, but I was sitting around and thinking that if you were talking about people being brought into a kind of organized life and death sort of situation, The Maze Runner is a really good one. Maze Runner is a dystopian story, and it's set in the same thing where these boys end up mysteriously in this area, and then they're surrounded by a maze that they need to escape in order to escape this, to escape this area and this deadly maze that can kill them. So yeah, those are my choices.
It's also a real similar setup as well. This idea that you've got people in a situation, you've got puppet masters pulling the strings and controlling what happens within the maze. I think that's a really good one to pair it up with. I've yet to really watch the other two in the series, but I enjoyed the first one, certainly.
Well, the books are pretty good, but I mean, I've read pretty much all the books, but I haven't watched the second or third movie though. I've only watched the first one, which was a surprisingly good adaptation. So I was really, I don't know what's taking me so long to catch up to the sequels.
So that obviously brings us to the end of another edition of After Hours, portion of Movies and Tea. Well, thank you everyone for listening, as always. You can obviously check out our full archive of episodes or our previous seasons to date over at moviesandteapodcast.wordpress.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and we're also on Instagram as well. And why not hit the like and subscribe button wherever you happen to listen to us, and maybe leave us a review, as it all helps raise the profile of the show. But until next time, thank you as always to my co-host Kim, and thank you to you for listening. And we'll be back again soon with another edition of Movies and Tea After Hours. Until then, good night.